Hello. This lecture is on federalism, and this will constitute the last lecture in our first unit of classes before the first test. I want you to get a good understanding from this lecture of two things. First, the difference between federalism and what came before it, which was a confederation. And secondly, how federalism and our understanding of it has changed over time. So let's start with the first concept. We spent a lot of time in the last lecture talking about the Confederation, or rather the Articles of Confederation. What the Confederation gave us was a system in which states had most of the sovereignty. Let's make this very clear. A confederation is identifiable by three key elements. First, while there is some sort of government of the whole unit, i.e. all of the country, it is the sub-state units which have all the sovereignty. Sovereignty is a fancy political science word, meaning they have final say. Today we talk about the national government in the United States having final say, which means that the national government has the ability to enter into treaties or to decide whether or not state laws are unconstitutional or not. In the Confederate system, the sub-state units had all the sovereignty, which meant that Pennsylvania had the final say over whether something in Pennsylvania was lawful or not. The Articles of Confederation pointed this out because it was in the Articles of Confederation that the sub-state units, i.e. the individual states, were the ones who decided whether or not to unite into the Articles of Confederation. The national government, and this is the final element of what makes it a confederation, had only the powers that the sub-state units, which for us were the states, decided to give it. I'll give you a rather odd example. But let's suppose that, for example, you were in a large family and your parents decided when you were kids to let you go to a movie, and they swore that you would have the final say. You could go to whatever movie you chose. But at the end of the day, it was your parents who decided to drive you to the movie, the parents who gave you the money to pay for the movie, and you all knew in the back of your heads if you were kids, that if you chose something that would not meet with your parents' approval, they would probably somehow just never quite have the time to drive you to that movie. Your parents would claim that they are letting you decide, and that you had sovereignty, but in the end, it was really your parents that had sovereignty. The same was true in reverse of the Articles of Confederation. The states gave some power to the national government, but at the end of the day, it was the states who decided what would get paid for, what they would donate their time and effort and energy for, and what they would agree to. Thus, even though there was a national government, it was in fact the individual sub-state units, states like New York and Pennsylvania and Maryland, who had the final say, or sovereignty. This, as we talked about in the last lecture, is part of what led to the downfall of the Articles of Confederation, and what gave us the system we have today, which is a federal system. It's important to realize that even our federal system is somewhat unique in the world and is very confusing to a lot of people, especially Europeans who live outside the United States. Because our federal system still allows the sub-state units, the states, to have some level of decision-making authority. This is very different from, say, the government of France, which, as those of you who have taken French class or perhaps European government know, the French government is divided into different sub-state units called départements. But at the end of the day, it is the national government that decides what happens in any of those départements. In the United States, we have obligations that come from both the national government and the subnational government, the states. We pay state taxes and national taxes, and these are set by very different legislatures. We have state legislatures and the national legislature that decide on very different things. And we vote for both state and national governments. For us as citizens, this means that different levels of government have different obligations to us. The national government, the United States government, provides the army. The state provides troopers and often provides local police and the National Guard. The national government will provide interstate highway funds, but the states will build the local roads that connect, and usually the roads that connect most of our smaller towns. The federal system has also evolved over time. For a while, and especially when the Constitution was first ratified, there was a perception that there was a distinction, that there was a clear line where the authority of individual states ended and where the authority of the national government began. This is characterized in the sort of constitutional debate between the enumerated powers and the implied powers. The enumerated powers are the powers in the Constitution that are specifically given to the national government. The implied powers, what fall under what's known as the elastic clause in the Bill of Rights, are those powers that are necessary for the federal government to do what it needs to do. However, it is made very clear in the Constitution that anything that is not enumerated as belonging to the federal government in the United States is reserved to the states. This was known as dual federalism. Over the course of time, and this is characterized a lot better in your book because your book sort of goes through the history of how this perception eroded, we've come to believe less and less in dual federalism, in this very bright line that says that the national/federal government can do these things and the state government should do these other things. We've come more and more to believe in something called cooperative federalism. What this means is that there's sort of a level in which state governments continue to carry out larger policies that are enacted by the federal government. And let me try to say that differently to make sure it's clear. What it means is that we still have state government, so Pennsylvania, Maryland, and now increasingly North Dakota and California and all kinds of states that were not originally envisioned. And they do make decisions, and they do raise taxes, and they do a lot of other things as well. However, they also act in partnership with the national government, which also sets policies and may also sort of help give them money to help them carry out some of their things. That is what's known as cooperative federalism. The easiest way to understand that for a lot of people is to understand how this plays out in financial terms. In financial terms, cooperative federalism works in a couple of different ways, but it's made very clear. It's made very clear through how things are funded, and your book talks a little bit about different ways in which things are funded. Block grants are one way in which cooperative federalism works. What a block grant is basically a chunk of money that comes from the national budget and is given directly to a state to administer largely how it sees fit. So, for example, the federal government may say something like, we need to build a highway that connects these towns, and we'll give a block grant to a state government to build that highway. It is built with federal funds, but largely the state can decide what contractors to hire, what route largely to choose, whether or not it needs to buy property and things like that. That's a block grant. Note the cooperation, the cooperative federalism at play here. The federal government has said this is what you need to use this money for, and then has given it to the state to do so. This is largely different from a categorical grant, which is slightly more restrictive of state power. A categorical grant is, once again, a grant of money that comes from the federal government, from the national government, but it's designed for a specific purpose and has a lot of very strict regulations attached to it. An example of a categorical grant which you all may be familiar with would be the Federal Student Lunch Program, which is money that comes from the national government and is given to states and to local school boards to feed children and give them a hot lunch when they might not otherwise be able to afford it. As some of you may remember from going to schools where such programs were enacted, there were a lot of strings attached to that. The federal government had very strict rules about what constituted a nutritious lunch. It had to have a certain number of vegetables. It had to have a certain number of calories. It had to have a certain amount of protein. This is a categorical grant, money that comes from the national government to state and local governments with very strict regulations about how it should be used. The last example of cooperative federalism, and for many state governments the most irritating form of cooperative federalism, is an unfunded mandate. An unfunded mandate is a law that is passed by Congress that basically puts an obligation on a state without specifying how that state should pay for it. Again, I think there's lots of ways that you can look at it, but think of, for example, any time that there's a regulation that says that increases the standards for something like education, or increases the standards for law enforcement. Those are things that are going to require the states to spend additional money, for example, to hire new teachers, to buy new equipment for law enforcement, and so on. But if there's no attached taxes or no attached grant to it, it becomes an unfunded mandate. The national government has mandated the states do these things, but has not explained how they were going to be funded. It's important to realize that finances are only one aspect of cooperative federalism, and cooperative federalism actually extends much beyond that. There are, if you take a look at the United States today, an increasing number of programs that come under central government control. There are a number of reasons why. Your book talks very much about sort of how financially and how much the country became more united financially, and how it became obvious to the government that things could not operate in isolation anymore. This is one very good explanation, but I'd like to sort of highlight a couple of others, not to diminish the one that was in the book. I would argue that there's a couple of other reasons why programs come under central government control. For many people, the most important reason is the idea of equal justice. That beginning with the Civil War, but increasingly through the Civil Rights era, the Constitution clashed with states' rights because in many cases states would pass laws which made people more unequal. Or at least the federal government would decide that they had a standard for equality that was not equal to what the states had. And thus, through litigation and through legislation, the national government would sort of put in its standards for what equal justice would demand in certain situations. Another reason why programs that used to be local are coming under central government control is because of the social safety net. Historically, Social Security, welfare, and a lot of the other programs that we consider part of the social safety net were national solutions to national problems. But setting up these national systems overrode the localized efforts to solve the problem. This does have both positive and negative sides to it. People who advocate local solutions would note that local solutions are tailored to local needs and can avoid overhead and waste. During the welfare reform acts of the Clinton administration, for example, a lot of the welfare reform was actually done more at the local level because people pointed out that the difficulty for someone in a rural area like Wisconsin to get a job is very different from the difficulties that someone in an urban area might have to get a job. For a very rural area like farm country, like Wisconsin, it might be really important to make sure that people have cars because there's no other way to get jobs. For a densely populated urban area, in contrast, cars actually become somewhat of a liability because it's near impossible to park them. And perhaps more importantly might be job training or other things that would help individuals in that community apply for the jobs that were available. On the other hand, the national solution for the social safety net have other benefits. One of them is that if you think of the Depression, which spawned a lot of Social Security and other things, one of these national programs arose because the local systems were pretty much strapped. The problem with a lot of local solutions is that if you've got a community that has 10, 20, 30% unemployment, as existed in the Great Depression and is actually existing in some areas a couple of years ago, the people who would be contributing to the social safety net, the people who would be contributing to places like the Salvation Army or local soup kitchens or churches, are often unemployed and using those resources themselves. A national solution has the ability to sort of send money from areas that might be doing comparatively well economically to areas that might be totally devastated. Moreover, a national solution allows people to avoid local biases. So that, for example, back in the Great Depression, perhaps a little bit so now, one of the challenges that people had was that if they went to a local help provider, I'm thinking in particular of churches were somewhat biased and tended to want to help people who were members of their own churches before they would help others in the community. This makes some sense to us, maybe, but it does mean that if you were new to the community or if you had, for whatever reason, dropped out of a church community or something like that, you were probably biased against and had a lot of difficulty getting benefits. The final reason why a national solution sometimes has benefits is that it prevents people from skipping from one state to another to get better benefits. Those of you who may have read something about the Great Depression will know that, for example, in the Great Depression, there was the problem of the quote-unquote Okies, people from the Dust Bowl whose farms were devastated and who thus inundated places like states like California, which had at least water and were not affected by the drought so much. Within recent memory, there were problems because Wisconsin offered much better welfare benefits than some of the neighbors surrounding it, and so it wound up getting a whole lot of people who were unemployed and really had no prospects, but moved to Wisconsin simply to benefit from the better welfare system there, and the better school system too, as I recall. Another reason why people have argued that more and more programs have become sort of part of the federal government is because as a country we've become less focused on pride in our individual states and more in pride as a nation. Most people, for example, don't really think very hard about why it's beneficial to live in Pennsylvania instead of Maryland or Pennsylvania instead of New York. Very few people have really and truly moved to a state because of its particular policies. More often, you see that individuals, if they choose to move because of something like a family tie, more likely a job offer, or a school. Now, it's important to realize that businesses do often choose to settle in one state or another because of some aspect of that state's government. But by and large, people don't really spend a lot of time thinking about it. When was the last time you engaged in a bitter rivalry with someone from another state because you were Pennsylvanian and proud of it? Finally, there's the question of economies of scale. Many industries, companies, and in some cases families are across state lines, which leads to convoluted business practices and convoluted questions about what is or is not legal. After all, if you've got a cousin in one state who is able to do something very particular with their income taxes or their driver's license, and you hear about it at a family reunion, you might be inclined to think you could do the same thing as well. A federal system leads to more standardization across the board. Indeed, one of the things that I discovered when I was working in Washington was that there was an effort long before the current national health care debate to allow small companies to create localized insurance pools across state borders. And this was a topic of potential federal legislation. The argument was that if you were a small local company that had two branches in one state and 2 branches in the neighboring state, you actually could not, it was much more difficult to offer standardized health insurance to everybody because you were a small company and you had to buy in insurance in both states' markets. This then became a burden for companies, and so they sought federal legislation to try to make sure that they could create standardized pools across state lines. In short, then, the increasing level of national control has come to us because of a couple of different reasons. One is the fact that it's become increasingly we've become increasingly more interconnected, and it's become, therefore, increasingly difficult to do things in one state that won't affect other states. But there are other reasons as well. Questions of equal justice, questions of wanting to extend a social safety net, and increasing questions of economies of scale and of a sense that state pride or state distinctiveness is not really as strong now as it was 200 years ago. That's all I have on federalism today. I hope you understand the difference between federalism and the Confederation that came before it, and the ways in which the federal system has changed in the last 200 years. I'll be available for questions tomorrow ahead of the exam, and I hope to hear from you all, and I hope you all do well on the exam. Have a good day. Bye-bye.